Today we're going to dive into one of the most tense and frightening scenarios for any adventurer. 7 horror stories involving trails gone wrong. Get ready to hear chilling stories from people who went for a hike in the middle of nature and ended up facing situations of pure despair, unexpected dangers and moments when survival became the only priority. We're going to explore real stories full of suspense, showing how a simple walk can quickly turn into a real nightmare when everything gets out of control. So, sit back, make sure you know the way back, and let's start this spine-chilling journey. Oh, and before the trail disappears beneath your feet, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. This helps the channel a lot and ensures that you don't miss any scary content like this. Let's go. 1. The echo of footsteps. The disappearance of a group of friends on the High Pines Trail in Montana's Bitterroot National Preserve in September 2019 has become one of the most disturbing cases in the U.S. Park Service's archives. The following is pieced together from the sole survivor's testimony, audio recordings found at the campsite, and notes left in trail journals. It all started as a typical fall adventure. 5 friends, Mark, Rachel, Tyler, Emily, and Josh, decided to explore one of the lesser-known trails in the reserve, known for its pristine landscapes and isolation. They were experienced hikers, equipped with GPS, short-range radios, maps, and 3 days' worth of supplies. The plan was simple: hike 25 miles in 3 days, camping at predetermined spots. On the first day, the group moved quickly, excited by the mild weather and the trees tinged with yellow and red. That night, they set up camp near a creek and recorded videos for social media, laughing and telling stories. Everything seemed perfect, except for one detail. Mark reported hearing footsteps behind the group during the afternoon, but the others attributed it to the echo of their own voices in the dense forest. The next morning, Rachel noticed that some of the trail markings made with color tape were missing. Tyler suggested that animals might have taken them, but Emily, more observant, noticed fresh human footprints near the campsite, parallel to theirs. The group continued on, but the atmosphere changed. At each stop, they heard footsteps in the distance, always in sync with theirs, as if someone was imitating their movements. In the afternoon, while crossing a stretch of dense forest, they heard whispered voices among the trees. They seemed like distorted echoes of their own conversations, repeating phrases spoken minutes before. Rachel recorded an audio, but the sound she picked up was just the wind. Their discomfort grew, but they decided not to comment on the matter any further, fearing that it would fuel their paranoia. The second night, the weather changed. The wind picked up and the forest seemed thicker, drowning out even natural sounds. As they were preparing dinner, they heard branches snapping a few feet from their campsite. Mark went out with his flashlight to investigate, but found nothing except footprints that seemed to circle the area. Josh suggested that they might be hunters, but he found no signs of campfires or hunting equipment. Tensions grew when, upon returning to camp, they noticed that some of their backpacks had been moved. In the early morning, Rachel woke up to the sound of someone walking around the tents, imitating the rhythm of their breathing. When she left the tent, she saw no one, but she found fresh footprints all around the group. The group decided to sleep in shifts, but fatigue soon got the better of them. The next morning, Josh was missing. They woke up to find their tent empty, with all their belongings intact. They searched for hours, shouting his name, but all they heard was the echo of their own voices. Tyler suggested activating the emergency GPS, but it didn't work. The screen showed interference, as if something was blocking the signal. With no other option, they decided to follow the trail, hoping to find Josh along the way or hear a distress signal. The group was now on high alert. At every turn, they stopped to listen. The footsteps continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Emily suggested that they were being followed by someone who knew the forest well. Their fear grew. As the day went on, they began to notice other signs: trail tape cut and discarded on the ground, unknown shoe prints, branches deliberately broken into upside-down arrows. At one point, they found Josh's bracelet hanging from a branch, as if in warning. At night, they decided to set up camp in a more open area, trying to avoid ambushes. But even there, they felt surrounded. Emily woke up with the feeling that she was being watched, and when she looked into the woods, she saw a motionless silhouette between the trees, which disappeared as soon as she shined her flashlight. The group barely slept, every sound amplified by the growing fear. On the third day, Mark disappeared. The group woke to muffled screams, and, when they left their tents, found only Mark's tracks heading towards the forest, which soon disappeared among the leaves. Despair took over. Emily and Rachel wanted to turn back immediately, but Tyler insisted on continuing on to the next support point, where they could find a radio signal or other hikers. Along the way, they heard voices calling their names from different directions. The voices were identical to those of their missing friends, but they sounded mechanical, like poorly played recordings. The group picked up their pace, but they felt increasingly disoriented. The GPS continued to fail, and the trail markers mysteriously disappeared. At one point, they found Mark's t-shirt carefully folded on a rock, and next to it, a handwritten note. "Go back. You're being watched." Fear turned into paranoia. Tyler began to suspect any movement, even accusing other hikers who crossed their path of being involved. Emily cried silently, while Rachel tried to keep the group together. The forest seemed to close in around them, making each step more difficult. On a steep stretch, they heard footsteps behind them again, perfectly synchronized, but when they looked back, there was nothing. At dusk, Emily disappeared. Tyler and Rachel, now alone, decided not to sleep. They sat with their backs to a tree, holding knives and flashlights. During the night, they heard footsteps approaching, then moving away, always imitating the rhythm of their own footsteps on the ground. At one point, Rachel heard her own voice whispering her name behind her. She turned around and saw nothing but darkness. Exhausted, Tyler ended up falling asleep for a few minutes, and, when he woke up, realized that Rachel was also gone. When the sun rose, Tyler was alone. In shock, he walked aimlessly until he found a service road, where he was rescued by park rangers. He reported everything to the police, but could not explain how his friends had disappeared without a trace. The search lasted for weeks, but no trace of the missing men was found. No clothes, no equipment, no marks of struggle. The case was filed under disappearance under suspicious circumstances. The audio recorded by Rachel, analyzed by experts, contains the sounds of footsteps and whispers, but nothing conclusive. Since then, the High Pines Trail has been closed to the public, and locals avoid talking about the subject. The mystery remains. Someone, or something, knows every corner of that forest and knows how to erase all traces, even the echoes of footsteps. 2. Signs in the forest. The disappearance of 3 hikers in the Black Forest, Germany, in August 2020 remains one of the most disturbing cases in the region's police records. The mystery, marked by disturbing details and a constant feeling of persecution, was extensively investigated but never fully solved. The following account was reconstructed from the diary found, audio recordings and statements from the sole survivor. Lena, Max, and Jonas, longtime friends, decided to explore a little-known trail in the Black Forest, famous for its dense vegetation and labyrinthine paths. They were experienced hikers, equipped with maps, compasses, GPS, and supplies for 3 days. The goal was to complete 35 kilometers, camping at strategic points. On the first day, the group advanced excitedly, recording the landscape in photos and videos. At night, they camped near a stream and shared stories around the campfire. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail. Lena noticed strange marks on the trees, symbols scratched with a knife, with no apparent meaning. Early on the second day, they found personal belongings scattered along the trail, a torn backpack, a pair of gloves, a crumpled map. None of them recognized the items. Max suggested that they belonged to other hikers, but the feeling of manipulation grew. As they advanced, the marks on the trees multiplied and became more complex, forming mysterious patterns. Jonas tried to decipher them, without success. The GPS began to fail, indicating impossible routes and constantly recalculating. The group realized that they were being guided away from their original path. During the afternoon, they heard footsteps in the woods, but never saw anyone. The sound seemed to follow their movements, speeding up or slowing down according to the group's pace. Lena felt a constant chill, and Max looked back every few minutes. At dusk, they found an abandoned cabin and decided to spend the night there. Inside, there were signs of recent presence. Food remains, an extinguished campfire, more symbols scratched into the walls. The air was heavy, and the silence of the forest seemed more oppressive inside. While Max tried to light a fire, Lena and Jonas explored the cabin, finding objects left behind: a rusty knife, pieces of rope, an old radio with no battery. Jonas made notes in his diary, tried to record everything. On the second day, the tension increased. The group felt watched at every step. Personal objects began to disappear mysteriously, and the marks on the trees indicated contradictory directions. At one point, they followed a trail that seemed to lead them back, but they ended up in an unknown spot, surrounded by tall, dense trees. Fear took over. Max suggested turning back, but Jonas insisted on finding a way out. During the night, they heard whispered voices and footsteps around the camp. Lena, trying to stay calm, recorded an audio, but all she could hear was the wind and the rustling of leaves. Sleep was light and interrupted by constant noises. Lena woke up with the sensation that something was moving near her, but when she opened her eyes, she saw only darkness. Max and Jonas were also restless, exchanging worried glances. On the third day, Jonas disappeared. His tent was empty, with his belongings scattered around. Lena and Max searched for hours, but found no trace. Their desperation grew. They decided to follow the trail, even though they knew they were being led into a trap. Along the way, they found Jonas's belongings carefully left behind. The marks on the trees became threatening, with symbols that looked like warnings. The GPS continued to fail, and the feeling of being hunted grew stronger. The following night, Lena and Max were surrounded by shadows moving among the trees. They managed to escape, but Max was injured. Lena, alone, walked until she found a dirt road, where she was rescued by local residents. She reported everything to the police, but the search for Jonas and those responsible was unsuccessful. The case was filed as disappearance under suspicious circumstances. The trail remains closed, and residents avoid the area, fearing that someone is still manipulating the forest paths, guiding the unwary to an unknown destination. Signs in the forest, marks that disappear, objects that appear and disappear, and the certainty that someone is always watching. An invisible trap where the forest is not just a setting, but an active participant in the terror. 3. The last checkpoint. The Black Ridge Ultramarathon, held in October 2021 near Queenstown, New Zealand, is often cited as one of the darkest episodes in the history of adventure sports. The following account is reconstructed from the testimony of the sole survivor, GPS records and fragments of radio messages captured during the event. The Black Ridge was known for challenging even the most experienced runners. The 100-kilometer course traversed steep trails, dense forests, and remote valleys, demanding extreme physical and mental fitness. That year, around 60 athletes from different countries lined up at the starting line, excited for the challenge and the promise of stunning views. The first few kilometers were spent in a friendly atmosphere. Runners took turns in groups, sharing water, food, and stories. Checkpoints, set up every 20 kilometers, were essential support points where volunteers offered supplies and monitored the athletes' progress. The weather was unstable, with dense fog and a biting wind making visibility difficult. At one point, after about 50 kilometers, one of the runners, identified in the records as Adrian, decided to pick up the pace and distance himself from the main group. The goal was to gain time before the most difficult part of the race. As he progressed, he noticed that the silence around him was unusual, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and heavy breathing. Upon reaching the third checkpoint, Adrian was struck by the lack of activity. The tables were set up, but there were no volunteers or fresh supplies. The radio was out, and some water bottles had been knocked over. He called out to the organizers, but got no answer. The wind was making the warning tapes sway, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Adrian tried to contact the emergency radio, but only got static. He decided to wait a few minutes, believing that the volunteers might have temporarily moved away. However, time passed, and no one appeared. His concern grew when he noticed fresh footprints leading to and from the checkpoint, but none indicated a return to the race course. Determined to move on, Adrian continued along the trail, but soon realized that something was wrong. Signs of a struggle were visible in some places: marks of scuffed sneakers, a crushed isotonic bottle, a cap thrown among the bushes. The silence of the forest was occasionally interrupted by distant noises, like branches breaking or hurried footsteps. Further on, Adrian found another athlete's identification bracelet attached to a branch, stained with mud. Fear began to set in. He quickened his pace, alert for any movement around him. At one point, he heard muffled shouts coming from a side trail. He stopped, undecided whether to help or keep going. He decided to keep going, feeling the danger getting closer. With every kilometer, the signs of disorder grew. Torn off tape, torn backpacks, and trails of blood mixed with the dirt. Adrian realized that he was not the only one noticing the absence of the organizers. Other runners were disappearing along the way, without a trace. Paranoia took over. He began to look back every few minutes, convinced that he was being followed. When he reached the next support point, he found the place completely abandoned. The tents were torn apart, and the radios had been destroyed. On the ground, he found a handwritten note: "Trust no one. Get off the trail." The message seemed like a desperate warning from someone trying to warn the next athletes. Night fell quickly, making it even more difficult to find his way. Adrian used his flashlight to follow the trail markings, but realized that some had been altered to lead him the wrong way. In a moment of desperation, he entered a clearing and saw, in the distance, the silhouette of a person standing motionless, watching him. He shouted for help, but the figure disappeared into the trees. Fatigue and fear began to cloud Adrian's judgment. He felt surrounded, as if someone were leading him into a trap. At one point, he heard quick footsteps behind him. He ran, tripping over roots and rocks, until he fell into a shallow ditch. There, he found an open backpack containing another runner's documents and a dirt-stained knife. Not knowing where to go, Adrian decided to abandon the main trail and take a shortcut through the dense forest, risking himself in unknown terrain. The sound of footsteps and whispers accompanied him, sometimes close, sometimes distant. At a certain point, he saw flashlights between the trees, but he didn't know if they were other runners or the people responsible for the terror that had taken hold of the race. After hours of wandering in the darkness, Adrian spotted a brighter beam of light. He approached cautiously and found a rescue team, called by family members worried about the lack of news of the athletes. Disoriented and in a state of shock, Adrian was taken to the hospital, where he reported everything he had witnessed. The search for the other runners and organizers lasted for weeks, but few were found. Most of the missing people were never located. The case was filed as missing under suspicious circumstances, and Black Ridge was never held again. To this day, locals avoid talking about what happened that night, and the trail remains closed, shrouded in silence and mystery. What's up, guys? The stories of trails gone wrong are spine-chilling, aren't they? If you're enjoying these suspenseful stories, take a quick break, subscribe to the channel, and leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and motivates me to continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. Now, let's get back to the next stories. There are still many mysterious trails ahead. 4. Missing in the Canyon. The disappearance of Sarah Thompson and Michael Reed, which occurred in March 2023 in a remote canyon on New Zealand's South Island, remains one of the region's most enigmatic and disturbing cases. The following account is reconstructed from the diary found, recovered audio recordings, and the testimony of the sole survivor, a local guide who found traces of the couple. Sarah and Michael, both seasoned adventurers, decided to explore the Huanganui Gorge, an area known for its wild beauty and extreme isolation. The couple planned a 3-day expedition, equipped with climbing, camping, and radio equipment. The idea was to document the journey for a travel blog, but what started as an adventure turned into a nightmare. On the first day, the couple set off along a narrow trail that wound between steep rock faces and dense vegetation. The weather was changeable, with low clouds and cold winds that cut through the canyon. Sarah recorded everything with her camera, while Michael analyzed maps and coordinates. The isolation was total. There was no cell phone signal, and the radio worked only for short distances. During the afternoon, they found abandoned equipment, torn backpacks, empty bottles, and worn-out shoes that clearly belonged to other missing hikers. The couple felt a chill, but decided to keep going, believing that the previous hikers had given up or gotten lost. The silence of the place was oppressive, and the thick vegetation made it difficult to see beyond a few meters. That night, they set up camp in a small clearing. As they prepared dinner, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. Branches breaking, leaves being stepped on, and the distant sound of footsteps. Michael tried to calm Sarah, telling her that they were probably wild animals, but they both felt like they were being watched. The wind carried with it almost inaudible whispers, and the feeling of vulnerability grew with each passing minute. On the second day, tensions mounted. The couple noticed that their gear had been tampered with during the night. Ropes were partially frayed, food was missing, and maps were marked with unfamiliar symbols. Sarah found a small camera hidden in the trees, pointing toward their campsite. Fear set in. They began to notice that personal items they had left behind at earlier points on the trail had been gathered up and organized into piles, as if someone was monitoring their every move. The couple felt hunted, and the sense of danger became palpable. During the afternoon, they found a rustic cabin, apparently inhabited. The door was ajar, and inside there were signs of recent life. Hanging clothes, food scraps, and an old radio. Michael tried to turn on the radio, but only picked up static. The place gave off a strong smell of smoke and damp earth. They decided not to go inside, but the human presence nearby was undeniable, and the forest seemed to watch them in absolute silence. At dusk, the couple tried to return, but realized that the trail was blocked by branches and rocks, as if someone wanted to keep them trapped in the canyon. Desperation took over. They set up camp in a different place, but the noises and the feeling of being watched did not stop. The night was bitterly cold, and they both slept little, waking up at every strange sound coming from the forest. In the early hours of the morning, they heard whispered voices and footsteps around the camp. Sarah tried to record the sound, but the camera's battery mysteriously ran out. Michael, armed with a knife, stood guard, but nothing appeared. The couple knew they were not alone. Fear turned to paranoia, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. On the third day, they decided to try an alternative route out of the canyon. As they hiked, they found more abandoned equipment, including a radio with recorded distress messages, but no response. The feeling that someone was following them was constant. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with steep ravines and trails that seemed to end in dead ends. Suddenly, Michael disappeared. Sarah heard a muffled scream and ran towards him, but found only footprints leading into the dense forest. She tried to call out to him, but silence answered. Panic took over. Alone, Sarah tried to find her way back, but the forest seemed like a maze, and at every turn she felt as if she were being watched by invisible eyes. After hours of walking, Sarah was found by a local guide, who took her to the nearest village. The guide reported finding traces of the couple, including organized equipment and signs that someone lived in the forest, collecting everything the lost people left behind. The place was full of old objects, backpacks, clothes, and utensils, all carefully piled in hidden clearings. Sarah survived, but never returned to the canyon. Michael was never found. Police investigated, but found no solid clues as to who was responsible. The case was filed as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. Locals avoid the area, saying the canyon holds secrets that no one should know. Sarah and Michael's story is a grim warning to anyone who ventures into remote places. Nature isn't always the greatest danger. Sometimes terror lurks in the trees, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. 5. The Lookout Observer. The case that occurred in September 2022 in the Scottish Highlands, involving the disappearance of two friends at an isolated viewpoint, has become a reference in safety training for hikers in the United Kingdom. The following account was reconstructed from the testimony of the sole survivor, audio recordings, and police investigations. Glencoe Lookout was known for its stunning views and absolute seclusion, attracting adventurers seeking silence and untouched landscapes. Liam and Oliver, friends since college, decided to camp there over a long weekend, bringing along their hiking gear, supplies, and cell phones, which soon lost signal. The plan was simple: hike up to the lookout, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. Late in the afternoon, they reached the top and set up their tent near the edge of the cliff. The cold wind and absolute silence created an atmosphere of tranquility, but also of vulnerability. As they prepared dinner, they talked about old trips and laughed about the hardships of the journey. The sun set quickly, and darkness enveloped the viewpoint. Around 10 p.m., as they watched the starry sky, Liam noticed a faint light moving between the trees at the foot of the cliff. At first, they thought it was another group of hikers, but soon they realized that the lanterns were multiplying and advancing slowly, surrounding the viewpoint in a silent semicircle. The The sound of footsteps on dry leaves became increasingly clear, and the relaxed atmosphere gave way to tension. Oliver suggested that they might be rangers, but Liam felt a chill. Their movements were too coordinated, and no one was responding to their calls. Every minute, the lights grew closer, and the sound of low voices, almost whispers, could be heard, but no words could be understood. The friends put out the fire and hid behind a rock, trying to watch without being seen. Time passed slowly, each second marked by the creaking of branches and the rustling of vegetation. At one point, Liam realized that the flashlights were being used to signal each other, blinking in regular patterns. It was as if the group were silently communicating, coordinating their movements to close the siege. The wind carried with it the smell of smoke and wet earth, and they both felt the cold intensify, compounded by growing fear. Suddenly, they heard the snap of branches just behind the tent. Someone was there, just a few feet away. Liam held a camping knife, while Oliver tried in vain to turn on his cell phone. It said no service. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and shadows began to circle the camp, blocking any escape route along the main trail. Within minutes, it was clear that they were surrounded. One of the intruders began rummaging through the tent, while others rummaged through backpacks and equipment, unhurriedly, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Liam and Oliver tried to flee down the slope, but were intercepted by two hooded men armed with batons and powerful flashlights. The attackers didn't say a word, only signaling their friends to be quiet. They were taken to a nearby clearing, where other hikers were tied up and gagged. It was clear that the group of criminals had been monitoring the area for some time, choosing victims from those camping alone or in small groups. Valuables were collected, and the hikers were kept under surveillance until the criminals deemed it safe to release them, or, in some cases, simply let them disappear into the woods. During the early hours of the morning, Liam managed to free himself from his restraints and crawl through the woods, guided only by the distant sound of a stream. Time seemed to drag as he scrambled through the bushes, dodging branches and rocks, hearing muffled screams and the sound of flashlights being waved in the distance. At one point, he stopped behind a tree, overhearing two of the criminals talking in low voices about the next group that would arrive in the morning and about leaving no traces. Liam walked for hours until he found a road, where he was rescued by a local farmer. In shock, he reported everything to the police, who began an intensive search for the gang and the missing people. The investigation revealed that the group of criminals had already acted in other tourist spots in Scotland, always following the same pattern: remote surveillance, coordinated attacks, and disappearance of the victims. Only part of the belongings were recovered, and most of the missing people were never found. The case was filed as kidnapping and disappearance under suspicious circumstances. Glencoe Lookout remains open, but signs warn the risks of camping alone or without communication. For many, the landscape now carries the weight of silence and fear, and those who pass by at night swear they hear footsteps and whispers coming from the woods. Reminders of an attack meticulously planned by those who know every trail, every hiding place, and watch without being seen. 6. Trail of No Return. The disappearance of a group of scouts in the Borgafell Forest in Scandinavia in October 2022 is one of the darkest and most mysterious cases in the region. What was supposed to be an adventure of learning and contact with nature turned into a nightmare of survival and terror. The story was reconstructed from the diaries found, recovered audio recordings, and the testimony of the sole survivor. The group consisted of 6 young scouts, led by experienced guide Henrik Larsson. They set off on a 5-day expedition into the dense Borgafell forest on the border between Norway and Sweden, with the aim of learning survival skills, orienteering, and teamwork. Equipped with maps, compasses, machetes, and basic supplies, they were confident and excited. For the first few days, the trail seemed peaceful, despite the cold and damp weather typical of Scandinavian autumn. They advanced carefully, marking the path with colored ribbons and small signs to ensure their return. Henrik emphasized the importance of following the planned route and maintaining constant communication. On the 3rd day, they began to notice strange signs. Machete marks appeared on the trees, but they were not made by the group. They were precise cuts in patterns that looked like messages or warnings. Improvised traps, made with sharp branches and ropes, were found at strategic points along the trail. Henrik warned the group to be extra vigilant and avoid suspicious places. Tensions rose as some of the tapes they had placed disappeared. The group felt watched, and the silence of the forest seemed heavier, as if it were hiding something threatening. During the night, they heard the sound of footsteps and branches breaking, but they could not identify the source. The next morning, Sarah noticed that the compass was spinning out of control, as if there was magnetic interference. Henrik tried to remain calm, but his concern was evident. The group began to discuss the possibility that someone was manipulating the trail to disorient them. During the afternoon, they found more elaborate traps, nooses hidden in the leaves, camouflaged holes covered by branches and leaves, and nets strung between trees. One of the scouts, Emil, nearly fell into one of them, but Sarah saved him. The fear grew with every step. The group tried to change their route to avoid the places where the traps were most frequent, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The alternative paths led to dead ends or even denser areas that were difficult to traverse. The feeling of being hunted became increasingly real. During the night, the camp was invaded by strange sounds. Indistinct whispers, the snapping of branches, and the sound of something dragging through the trees. Henrik organized shifts to keep watch, but fatigue and fear made the task nearly impossible. Sarah recorded in her diary that she felt invisible eyes watching the group's every move. On the fourth day, Jonas mysteriously disappeared. The group searched for hours, calling his name, but found only more traps and machete marks, indicating that someone was hunting them. Henrik decided that they should abandon the trail and seek help, but the forest was like a maze, and the escape routes were blocked by natural obstacles and traps. As they tried to get their bearings, they came across a clearing where the personal belongings of other missing people were piled up: torn backpacks, dirty clothes, and crumpled maps. Fear turned to panic. The group realized that they were not only lost, but being hunted by someone who knew every inch of the forest. On the fifth day, Emil was captured. The group heard his muffled screams and tried to rescue him, but they were ambushed. Henrik was injured, and the group scattered in an attempt to escape. Only Sarah managed to escape and, after days of wandering through the forest, found a service trail where she was rescued by a search party. Sarah reported everything that had happened, describing a silent and relentless stalker who used traps and knew the forest like the back of his hand. The search was intense, but none of the other scouts were found. The case was filed as missing under suspicious circumstances. The Borgafell forest remains closed to expeditions, and locals avoid the area, fearing that the hunter is still there, waiting for his next victim. The story of the scout group is a grim warning about the dangers that can lurk on seemingly safe trails, where nature is merely the backdrop for a much more human horror. This account shows how the combination of isolation, environmental manipulation, and the presence of a human predator can turn a simple trail into a deadly trap, reinforcing the importance of preparation, caution, and respect for the unknown in remote natural environments. 7. The Missing Guide. The group of tourists arrived in the small village of Kandersteg, Switzerland, eager to explore the famous Devil's Valley Trail, known for its mysterious disappearances over the decades. They hired a local guide, Hans, a reserved and experienced man who promised to lead them safely through the secret paths of the dense forest that surrounded the area. The trail was famous not only for its beauty, but also for the mystery that surrounded it, with reports of people simply vanishing without a trace. At first, the hike was peaceful. Hans knew every rock, every curve, and shared local stories that mixed facts and legends, creating an atmosphere of fascination and apprehension. The group felt protected by the guide's presence, even with the heavy silence of the surrounding forest. The cell phone signal disappeared soon after the trail began, but no one worried. They were there to disconnect from the world. As they continued, Hans began to take lesser-known routes, deviating from the main trails. The group realized that they were entering more confined areas, where the sunlight barely penetrated. The tension grew, but the guide assured them that it was the quickest and safest route. However, strange signs began to appear. Fresh footprints that did not belong to any of them, branches broken in unusual patterns, and personal objects left behind, such as bottles and torn clothes. At each stop, the group felt the mood change subtly. The air seemed colder, the silence thicker. At one point, they passed a clearing where there were remains of an old campfire and pieces of rotting canvas, as if someone had recently camped there. They also found an old, wet diary with pages torn out and disjointed sentences about eyes in the woods and shortcuts that lead to nowhere. The guide read it quickly, visibly tensed, and urged the group on. As they walked, the group began to feel a constant presence, as if someone were watching them from afar. Sometimes, they glimpsed shadows between the trees that quickly disappeared. Footsteps that did not correspond to their own echoed through the forest, and indistinct whispers seemed to float in the air, increasing the feeling of vulnerability. At one point, they heard a loud crack coming from the opposite direction to which they were walking, as if someone was trying to approach without being seen. Hans stopped, stared into the bush, and asked for absolute silence, saying that it could be animals, but his expression betrayed concern. One night, they camped in a secluded clearing. While the group was resting, Hans mysteriously disappeared. They searched for hours, calling his name, but there was no answer. Fear took over. Without their guide, the group was vulnerable, lost in a forest that seemed to know their every step. They tried to follow the trail back, but the routes seemed to change, as if the forest were alive, manipulating the path. Markings they had made to orient themselves disappeared, and the group felt as if they were being watched. Sounds of footsteps and whispers echoed through the trees, but no one appeared. The feeling of being followed was constant. Time passed slowly, and tension among the group members increased. Some began to argue about the right direction, while others suggested waiting in the same place, believing that Hans would return. During the day, they noticed that personal items were disappearing or moving while they were distracted. They found unknown boot tracks near the camp, and one morning, they saw fresh footprints circling the tents. In a moment of desperation, they tried to climb a nearby hill to search for a radio signal, but the device only emitted static and strange noises, as if someone was interfering with the frequency. As the days passed, members of the group began to disappear one by one. Panic grew, and trust between them faded. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and the forest became a deadly labyrinth. Hans's disappearance turned out to be just the beginning of a nightmare that no one could have foreseen. The group tried to organize themselves, but fear and exhaustion made every decision difficult. Arguments escalated, and distrust grew. Some believed that the guide had betrayed them, while others feared that a human predator was lurking, using the knowledge of the forest to hunt them. One night, they heard muffled screams coming from the forest, but no one had the courage to investigate. Fear paralyzed any initiative. In a desperate attempt, they decided to follow a river that, according to Hans, would lead to a nearby village. The walk was arduous, with slippery terrain and dense vegetation. Along the way, they encountered disturbing signs, remains of old camps, torn clothes, and personal objects that did not belong to them. The feeling of being followed grew with each step. One particularly cold night, they heard distant screams echoing through the forest. The sound was human, but filled with despair and pain. The group tried to locate the source, but the darkness and terrain made progress difficult. Fear turned to terror. On the last day, only one woman remained, exhausted and terrified. She found a narrow trail that led to an old abandoned cabin. Inside, she found belongings of the missing, including Hans's diary, which revealed that he had been coerced by a local hunter, someone who knew every shortcut and used the forest to capture the unwary. The woman managed to escape and was rescued by villagers, who alerted the authorities. The search for Hans and the other missing people continued, but they were never found. The case was closed as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. The Devil's Valley Trail remains closed, and locals avoid talking about it. They say the forest holds dark secrets, and that anyone who ventures there may never return. The missing guide is a grim reminder that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in nature, but in the shadows that inhabit it. And so we come to the end of our 7 horror stories involving trails that went wrong. So, which one scared you the most? Will any of them make you think twice before venturing out on your next hike alone? Tell us in the comments which one was your favorite. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of trails and adventures, don't forget to leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and encourages me to bring you more spine-chilling stories. And if you're not a subscriber yet, take advantage now to subscribe and activate the bell.